Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming to this meeting of the Republican Labour Educational Forum, which is co-sponsored this evening by the Socialist Labour Network. So in this meeting, we're going to be considering, discussing and hearing about the constraints that have been exercised by the state on those who wish to speak out about the situation in Gaza and elsewhere where there's an imperialist conflict with what people want to say. We have two main speakers. We're expecting Richard Medhurst to join us, and we also have our comrade Tony Greenstein, who's going to talk about his experiences with the legal system at present. Before we hear from our speakers, Steve Freeman is going to provide an introduction for us.
Thank you, Esther and Tony and comrades, and hopefully Richard, if he's turning up. I'm only going to speak for about 5 minutes, and I'm not going to speak on the details of the cases because it's the specifics of the cases, because that's for Tony and Richard to talk about. We have the two comrades are really in the firing line now. We know about Tony arrested, I think, on the 20th of December 2024 and charged with expressing the wrong opinion or belief under section 12(1) of the Terrorism Act 2000, and Tony will tell us if that's subsequently changed. And I've heard about Richard's case on the Crispin Flintoff show yesterday. Maybe many of you comrades were there as well. My contribution, apart from expressing the solidarity that we all have and want to show to these two comrades here today, is to set the context for this issue. Context is very important if we'd be able to make sense of what is going on and what should be done about it. For me, and that's why we've given it the title we did, the big issue is the power of the Crown. And whilst Crown power could not exist in its current form without a monarchy, they're not the same thing. Crown power is state power exercised by ministers of the Crown, the Home Office, the Foreign Office, civil servants, police, security services, Crown prosecution services, His Majesty's judges, and the courts of law. And I might just add, as it's in the news today, the established Church of England is part of that establishment. And this power is not fixed, of course. It's subject to continual contestation by popular movements in history, like the Chartists, the suffragettes, the trade union movement, and of course lawyers in the courts, MPs in Parliament, movements out on the street. And I wanted to say this point to put this context. We're not simply living in this long period created from the Second World War, the post-1945 political and social contract, which we call the social monarchy, but a special epoch of stagnation and decline since the 2007-2008 financial crisis. Now, this epoch is not simply decline, but I think it's the death of the post-war social contract, the post-war social monarchy. And we've been in about 18 years of stagnation, degeneration, decay, even putrefaction. The degeneration of the social monarchy covers a whole series of events and crises which provide evidence of this degeneration, from austerity, the Scottish referendum in 2014, through the Corbyn leadership, the Brexit crisis, the COVID crisis, Ukraine, and last but by no means least, Palestine. The support the Crown has given to the Zionist genocide in Gaza, supplying weapons, military intelligence, and diplomatic cover, has highlighted the moral bankruptcy and the absence of democratic accountability. Since 2007, you remember, we've had 7 prime ministers: Brown, Cameron, May, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, and now Starmer. And every prime minister, I would say, has been worse than the previous one. And it's not just a measure of their personal corruption or their personal failings, but it's the fact that the Crown, the ship of state, is sinking, and Starmer's promise to turn the ship around will not stop it sinking. So we are now in a full-blown crisis of democracy, which is about the threat to our democratic rights and civil liberties and the two-party system. The Tories are facing some kind of existential crisis, and I think it will become clear that Labour, despite its massive parliamentary majority, is in the same state. The current expression of this crisis is seen in the rise of the Reform Party. So we think that the left needs to wake up and develop some radical answers to the growth of Crown power taking us in towards an authoritarian state. Now, I don't know what Richard or Tony will say about their cases, but their cases have to be understood, I believe, in this wider context of what is taking place. It's not about them, although they are in the firing line. It's about us. It's about we the people. Can we the people take control and secure some kind of new democratic settlement? It's about the power of the Crown versus the power of the citizens, which is why the title we gave it was The Crown versus Citizen Greenstein, Comrade Citizen Greenstein. We don't take control in the abstract, but through struggle to defend these comrades and many others, not only to defend our democratic rights and liberties, but to extend them and make this country a better place than it is. And that's the context that we have to see. This is not just about these incidents of two people, it's about the whole crisis, which the Palestinian issue, of course, is bringing to a head as well. And that's all I really had to say, is just to set the scene, as it were. So I think it's back to you, Esther.
Thank you very much, Steve. So that's really important context for our discussion this evening. I'm going to pass over to Tony now. Tony, let us know how you're doing. Look forward to hearing about your reflections on what's happening so far. Please do unmute and join us.
Welcome, everybody. I see there are 95 people here, so it's a very good attendance. And I'm going to really give some random thoughts and, if you like, some the experiences of myself. But maybe I should comment on Steve, because we're old sparring partners from the Socialist and the Labour movement. I don't see this as the Crown. I see this as the British state. And the British state acts as a, if you like, an adjutant, or you might call it a lapdog, to US imperialism at the moment, which is driving the genocide in Palestine. And that is, if you like, the context for everything that's happening today here. The unflinching support of the United States and Britain and Germany and most of Western Europe for what Israel has been doing in Gaza. I don't think you can understand it in any other way. And whether they are bourgeois democracies, monarchy, republics, or what have you, the situation is much the same. And we see today, I mean, in The Guardian, there's a story, and I don't know whether anyone can see it.
Yeah.
Britain's complicity with war crimes on arms exports, says ex-diplomat. In other words, there is a procedure within the Foreign Office and within government as a whole, whereby if there's clear evidence that war crimes are being committed by a country that's receiving arms from Britain, then those arms exports should be stopped. And yet deliberate obfuscation, obstruction, and whatever else has happened within government to ensure that a conclusion is never reached. Hence why Starmer in the House of Commons has denied there is a genocide, and is full of a Foreign Secretary, David Lammy, a man for whom I do not have enough contempt, could say that not enough people have died for it to be a genocide, when of course the definition of genocide is the destruction in whole or in part of a people. It has nothing whatsoever to do with the number of people killed, because Starmer, for example, when he was a human rights lawyer, inverted commas, appeared at the International Court of Justice about 30 years ago and argued that the killing of civilians in Vukovar 1200 constituted a genocide, and there was virtually unanimity. A genocide had been perpetrated in Srebrenica, where 8,000 people had died. Now, I agree. I certainly agree that Srebrenica was a genocide. But who can doubt when it may well be 200,000 to 300,000 people have died in Gaza, that that is not a genocide. And we know from the statements of intent of Israeli politicians, I mean, Amichai Eliyahu, who proposed dropping a nuclear bomb on Gaza, Netanyahu, who talked about the lessons of Amalek, Amalek being the story in the Bible where the tribe was wiped out by the children of Israel, down to the last child, an infant. Although it's apocryphal, it didn't actually happen. Nonetheless, people take these stories as true. So we see the utter hypocrisy, and that's also true in the United States. Similar reports by ex-members of the State Department that human rights reports would get to a certain desk and then they would go no further, because if they had gone any further, then the Patrick Leahy law, the Leahy law as it's called, would forbid and stop arms exports to Israel. And that is unconscionable for the US ruling class. And therefore, all the human rights laws in the world, all the provisions, all the caveats, all the restrictions counted for absolutely nothing. And we know that when South Africa brought its case to the International Court of Justice, which found it was plausible, and that was over a year ago, it was plausible a genocide was being carried out. The main State Department spokesperson said the case was meritless, and that's been the position of the United States ever since. So we also see, especially now with Donald Trump, who's signed executive orders sanctioning the International Criminal Court, that there is really a collapse in the legal architecture internationally. All the conventions and rules that have been drawn up in the wake of the Second World War, the Nazi Holocaust, have fallen by the way, because it's not in the interests of Western and US imperialism. So, as I say, that really is the context for everything I'm about to say. You may not know, someone's got their mic on. If they can turn it off and everyone can mute, that would be helpful. Thank you. You just look down to your left and your mic is there. My own experience was on December the 20th, 2023. I'd only just gone to bed, 7 o'clock in the morning, when there was a knock on the door, and who were there but two members of the anti-terror police with about 10 waiting in the street itself, and 2 or 3 vans. I was being arrested, I was told, or for a tweet I had posted a month before. Now, you might imagine at 7 o'clock in the morning, I don't have much idea of what tweets I may have posted a month ago. I don't have a photographic memory to that extent. And when I tweet in 5 seconds and then go on to the next tweet. So my only reaction was, this is Orwellian. In other words, I was being arrested, as had other people, incidentally. I wasn't the only one by any means. I was being arrested, not for anything I'd done, but for what I had said. And that is the nature of the misuse and abuse of the anti-terrorism laws. They're being used to silence people. They're not being used to deal with terrorism. I mean, we could go into that. I mean, terrorism, as most people understand it, although the definition in the Terrorism Act itself leans towards destruction of property and offence against the government rather than attacks on civilians. But most people know what terrorism is. It's the Manchester Arena bombing, it's the stabbings at London Bridge, and it's the Bataclan attacks of ISIS in Paris, the wanton murder of civilians for absolutely no purpose or reason, but simply to instill terror. And there's many other examples. The mowing down of people in Nice by a large articulated lorry, other attacks in Germany, and so on. And we also have to say, we have to be quite clear that those groups which exist, which are terrorists, such as ISIS, Al-Qaeda, have without exception been brought into existence by the foreign policy of Western imperialism. We know for a fact that the United States was involved in helping encourage the formation of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS, in order to divide and rule the opposition to its illegal invasion in 2003. We know that the bombing of Libya and the ousting of Gaddafi was done in coordination with jihadist groups. And we also know, because Hillary Clinton has told us, that Al-Qaeda was effectively the creation of the United States because it backed the Mujahideen against what was a relatively bourgeois democratic government under Babrak Kemal way back in '79, incidentally under Jimmy Carter, who's considered the human rights and the best president America has ever been for that. So this is not about terrorism in any shape or form. The specific terrorist group that I was accused of supporting, I mean, I was first told that I was being arrested under Section 12(1)(a) of the Terrorism Act 2000, but then I've been charged with inviting support under Section 12, not 12(1)(a). I'm not quite sure why the change. Possibly they didn't think the Section 12(1)(a) would stand up. Section 12(1)(a), for anyone who doesn't know, is it makes you an offence to express an opinion or belief which is supportive of a prescribed, that is a terrorist organisation, and to do so recklessly. So there's a very low, what you call mens rea, mental element to it. But also it's simply about expressing an opinion or belief. It's not about doing anything whatsoever. I've now been charged with the more ubiquitous Section 12, which is inviting support. So, I mean, just a few words on Hamas, because, of course, Hamas is demonized in the eyes of the Zionists and the British state and so on. And that is true for any resistance movement against colonialism or imperialism. All resistance movements have been demonized. Now, I mean, politically, I don't support Hamas. Why should I? It's an Islamist group. I'm a Jewish atheist. There'd be no reason at all why I would ideologically support it. But I support the Palestinian resistance, of which Hamas is a part. And of course, in my interview, the police really didn't understand that when I said that although I didn't support them politically, I would support the devil himself if he was fighting the Israelis, because when you're opposing genocide, you can't be too picky and choosy over who you support. I gave the example of the Polish Home Army, the resistance to the Nazis in the Second World War. I mean, it was deeply anti-Semitic and reactionary, and I wouldn't have supported it. But in the Warsaw Uprising against the Nazis, of course, I would support it. But there was subtle distinctions elude the police and much of the legal establishment as well. So I really want to comment on, or quote rather, a few things other people have said, one of whom is John Dugard, who was a UN rapporteur on human rights. He's a professor of international law and is highly respected. He's an ad hoc judge for the International Court of Justice. So he's someone whose opinion is pretty useful, to say the least. And he said, and I quote, "Terrorism is an emotive word that has no place in the assessment of the conduct of either a government or a resistance movement. One man's freedom fighter is another man's terrorist. Few would label today members of the French resistance in World War II as terrorists, and most would have no hesitation in describing the Nazi forces as terrorist. Yet today, Most Western states refrain from describing the acts of government forces as acts of terror, but have no hesitation in so describing the acts of resistance movements and other non-state actors. And that is really what it is about. Because, of course, the Nazis called the French resistance and the Polish and the Czech resistance terrorist. Czech resistance assassinated, I think it was 1942, Reinhard Heydrich, the engineer of the final solution. They certainly called that a terrorist act, and they took quite savage revenge on Czechoslovakia as a result of it, although nothing like Israel has done in respect of October the 7th. The Israeli behavior in Gaza in terms of a reaction to October the 7th outweighs anything Nazi Germany has done. And I'm not saying it's outweighed the Holocaust, but the Holocaust was not a reaction to what is described as terrorism. The reaction the Nazis, Orodosser, Glan, was Lidis, the Czech village, and so on, were horrific massacres, but they pale in comparison with what Israel has done. It's destroyed every hospital, every school, every university. It's bombed the tent encampments outside the hospitals. It's bombed the hospitals. It's gone in. It's arrested doctors, taken them to torture camps. At least one of them has died from torture. I mean, its behavior has been supported up to the hilt by Starmer, Trump, Biden, and so on. They have said not a word. I mean, we saw the hostages coming out, the Israeli hostages and the Palestinian hostages, and you only had to compare one with the other to know how Israel has behaved in this. But a blind eye has been turned consistently to the behavior of Israel. The very fact that Israel barred every journalist from the area of operations shows in itself what they were up to, because if they had nothing to hide, then of course they would not have inhibited the international news media from coming in. Instead, they've had to rely on Palestinian stringers to get out the stories, and Israel has killed nearly 200 of them as well, in a determined effort to close down any news of what is happening. And this is the context for the arrests in Britain. There's not just to say me, there's Richard Medhurst, there's Sarah Wilkinson, there's Natalie Strecker in Jersey, who's been arrested and charged. And there are other people, some of whom we don't know about. But the pattern is the same. It's to intimidate the Palestine Solidarity movement, and in particular, if you like, the radical wing of it. And that's what this is. And we have to be quite clear. I mean, my trial is set for January the 6th, I think it is, next year. But we have to be clear that this is not about terrorism. This is about democratic rights. This is about freedom of speech. And it's also about the kind of society we're in, because I know it's an oft-used word, but we are looking at a crisis in capitalism, in a sense, in the 21st century, whereby international law has been torn up, whereby Trump can declare openly he wants the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which goes against every international law precept. Because, I mean, you saw, Nazi Germany, its program was first ethnic cleansing before it turned to genocide. Although in Israel's case, I think they've turned to genocide first and then ethnic cleansing. But there may be a determined effort to remove the Palestinians of Gaza, although I think it will be unsuccessful. The Palestinians of Gaza have made it very clear they're not going anywhere, given their experiences of the Nakba. But we have a lawless madman in the White House. So, I mean, anything is possible, although I think he's going to find it very difficult to get away with this one. But that, I say, is the context for our arrests. We are really, of course, small fry, but at a time when the right to demonstrate in Britain is under attack, we saw the events in January whereby the police decreed that Palestine marches are somehow a threat to Jewish worshippers. So they've completely absorbed the Zionist narrative, if you like, that if you support the Palestinians, then you must be anti-Jewish. We had the absurdity last year with the police putting a cordon between the Jewish bloc and the rest of the demonstrators on the grounds that somehow we must be under threat from the rest of the demonstration. So they racialize everything, but that's also part of the legacy of colonialism. So I think, I don't know how long I've gone on for, but I've probably spoken too long already. So I will wind up and let other people contribute and then come back later. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. Fascinating to hear what you say and your observations about what's driving it. So we will be coming back to you later. We'll be coming back to you and to Richard and to Steve at the end of the meeting. And in between, when we've heard from Richard, we'll invite contributions from the floor. I just wondered, Tony, well, while we're just waiting on Richard for a second, I wonder if you know how your case came to the attention of the police, whether, who you think was behind. Somebody must have reported it.
Oh, yes. I mean, a woman called Heidi Bachram, who's on Twitter, Heidi, I think, _ Bachram, but you'll find it. You can give her a buzz. She openly boasted that she'd reported various tweets, speeches. She's based in Brighton or in Hove.
Oh, okay. So we think we know.
Oh, yeah. I mean, there's Zionists encourage each other to become informers. I mean,
yes,
I always tell them that they're in a good tradition because under Nazi occupation, the Nazis relied on Jewish informers to out people, Jews who were hiding from the Nazis, who were called submarines. So, I mean, the Nazis, having collaborated during the Nazi occupation, have a long tradition of that.
Yes, of course. So I thought that might be the case. So unfortunately, Richard, who was with us, did briefly unmute, and now he's disappeared.
I'll just say why Richard may have problems.
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, last week, I mean, Richard had already been arrested at the port and detained for 24 hours by the police, because the police have special powers at ports.
Yes.
And was already, I think, being charged. He's a journalist.
Yes,
last
of course.
Week,
yes.
He lives in Austria, and he was tricked into visiting the police, where he was told he was going to be arrested. They took him back to his flat, and they took every single electronic device from him.
Yes.
So he's been relying on something that has been lent to him by his daughter, I think. So he may have great difficulty in actually getting online and staying online because he's working with equipment he's not particularly familiar with. So I'm sorry about that if that is the case. But Richard has put out some videos which people are welcome to have a look at.
Yes. Okay. Well, we can post. Can we post those in the chat? So where we are now is we've got 99 participants in the meeting. So we've got one space left for Richard. So I'm going to be watching, and the other co-hosts will be watching the waiting room to see when or whether Richard manages to come back to us. In the meantime, I'm going to go to the floor to see whether anyone can contribute any experiences that anything like those have been encountered by Tony or Richard. Matthew, you've got your hand up. Will you unmute, please?
I think, I mean, the key thing here is the change in the nature of US imperialism. I mean, the US, of course, has over many decades, certainly since World War II, has basically tried to state of itself that, of course, it is the standard bearer for democratic rights, free speech, etc., against all these terrible oppressive regimes of assorted varieties. I mean, now, of course, the offer is somewhat different. If you offend us, we'll kill you. And the use of mass killing, which of course has always been an instrument of US policy, is now explicitly a prime method. There's no offer on democracy or democratic rights. I mean, democratic rights have been rolled back by Trump in the US and across the rest of the world. So it's a complete change in those terms, and we have to see it in that context. At the same time, also what we're seeing, clearly is the Gaza, of course, demonstrates this. And in that sense, we're also, of course, we should acknowledge our debt, which is very deep, in my view, to the journalists of Gaza, the Palestinian journalists of Gaza, who have demonstrated to the world on a daily basis what is going on, despite the fact, obviously, the effort of the Israelis to exterminate them. That, of course, they face death on a daily basis, explicitly, because precisely in order to try and conceal that fact. They failed, obviously, but that's the difference between what happened, say, in Gaza, what's been happening in Gaza, or what happened in parts of Iraq or Afghanistan or elsewhere. The fact that the Palestinian journalists have revealed this to the world and shown us in graphic detail exactly what these forces are like. The other thing, of course, and I think I agree with Tony, obviously, that the behaviour of the IDF is much worse than the Nazis. I mean, the Nazis didn't have a policy of flattening hospitals, whereas the IDF, of course, see this as a principal method. And you can look at everything else as well. I mean, you look at sort of the method of the IDF. Basically, they went into Gaza to kill civilians. They weren't interested in actually fighting Hamas. They were very bad at fighting Hamas, but they went in there to kill as many civilians as they could. The other point about this, of course, is that what it has also demonstrated to the entire world's population is that all our politicians, all the imperialist politicians, of all the major countries, are mass murderers. They have no interest, or it doesn't make them turn a hair. This form of mass killing, they're quite happy to support it. They're quite happy to help carry it out. As the point, I think, in terms of British, if you look at the British government is not complicit in the genocide in Gaza. If you look at Declassified UK in particular, it's quite clear they're actually participants. They're participants in the genocide in Gaza. They assisted directly to carry it out. That's the kind of people we're dealing with.
Thank you.
And the world should be warned. I mean, should be warned about the nature of these people. That is how they will behave towards anybody who they see as offensive to them. This is a grave warning to the whole world that this is the force. These are the forces and the types of people you're dealing with. That's how they intend to proceed. Thanks.
Yes. There is an increased naked ruthlessness with regard to attacks on people who challenge the status quo in the state. I think that's visible across the whole of the world. So thank you for that, Matthew. I am going to look for further contributions from the floor. We've got some interesting contributions in the chat. We've got a hand up, Malcolm. Would you like to make your contribution or pose your question, perhaps? Please unmute yourself. Thank you.
I would just like to say that that we're all horrified with what we see on television in Gaza, and it's obviously truly awful. And we're horrified by how the police are acting towards people like Tony, and that is truly horrible. And we're all horrified by President Trump. But I think we need to put it in some sort of perspective. It was more or less always like this. I was born in the Second World War, and hundreds and thousands of people have been killed all over the place. And since then, people have been killed in Korea and Vietnam and so on, and politicians have been involved in all these things. And I'm not saying we shouldn't be horrified and do what we can against it, but I think there is a reaction because Trump is so personally obnoxious. I mean, he seems maybe more horrible than other people have been. I mean, Clinton said that in Rwanda it wasn't a genocide, because if he had said it was a genocide, he would have to have done something about it, which he didn't. I mean, there was the war in Biafra, and when Michael Stewart was labelled a war criminal. I mean, it's. I mean, when I was thinking that it was jolly good that Harold Wilson had been elected as the Prime Minister of England after years and years of Tories, he was actually getting rid of the Chagos Islanders by doing a secret deal with the US about Polaris missiles. I mean, we're not really facing anything particularly new, I don't think. I mean, it might be more in our face, but it's been going on ever since I've been alive, which is quite a long time now. Thank you.
Thank you, Malcolm. I was particularly struck in the BBC coverage of the conflict in Gaza, in the way that they referred to the sides, as it were. They refer to Hamas as armed Hamas fighters, and they refer to the IDF as IDF soldiers. The propaganda runs very deep, and this is the BBC. We've got a question in the chat from Mervyn about why is it that the Europeans are so beholden to US military power, and an answer from Tony, and then why is it that Europeans politicians are under the yoke of American policy? And also a question from Barclay: why is it taking so long for Tony's court hearing to be heard? 2026. Of course, that puts Tony under huge pressure for a whole year. Do you have any comment on that, Tony?
Yes, it's simply the court backlog. I mean, I had a trial in 2023 for having participated in a Palestine action outing at Shenstone, and I waited 2 years for that. So, I mean, there is a real, I mean, that was partly because of COVID, but there is a real backlog in the courts, and so you won't get on before a year.
Yeah, but there is fast tracking, isn't there? So the recent civil unrest, for example, they're fast tracked almost immediately into court and into jail.
That was to the magistrates' court,
okay,
which are much quicker. But as you say, they were fast. Hold on, as you say, they were fast tracked. When it comes to these Crown Court cases, there are delays, and I suspect that it might be put back from the January as well. But yes, of course, it puts you under immense pressure because you have this thing waiting over you for a year or more. So it is not easy. But I mean, you just have to take it as it comes and not buckle under the pressure, as it were. And that's the case for many, many people. I mean, they're facing exactly the same conditions, if you like.
Yes. Well, solidarity with you, comrade. I've got Tim with his hand up. Tim, would you like to comment or ask a question?
Yeah, okay. I just wanted to comment on your remark, Esther, 2 or 3 minutes ago. You mentioned the shameful conduct of the BBC, or maybe you didn't use that adjective. I would certainly agree that the BBC has been particularly shameful in the last few days in the way that it has talked about those 3 hostages who were released by Hamas a few days ago now, and saying, this was on the 10 o'clock news on Friday night, I think it was, on television news. These poor hostages, look how emaciated they are. Look how much weight they've lost. Well, you know, if the Gaza Strip has been under bombardment for well over a year and prevented from receiving any food at all, I think those guys were very lucky still to be alive. And yet there they were devoting an inordinate part of the news bulletin to the fact that these guys looked emaciated. Well, I'm glad they were freed, and I'm sure they'll recover in due course. But there's plenty of Gaza who yeah, all right. I think I've made the point.
Thank you, Tim. Absolutely that, and it's hardly surprising that where there's no food, that people get emaciated. I have and if that's the worst they could come up with, I mean, yeah, over to you, Mike Hope.
Yeah, well, add to that, Tim, the numbers of Palestinians, of those who've been released, who've been tortured, and
Yes.
whose general state, the numbers who have had to go straight to hospital.
Yes.
You know, I, like you and like most people, have been really struck by the way that the establishment media, the BBC and others, have homed in on this. Because actually, the first few Israeli hostages who were released were actually in pretty good shape. Some of them were looking pretty well fed. Some of them were looking, sort of quite well orientated and so on. And it was in vast contrast. Now, we come back to the sort of the intentional blindness and myopia of those in power and those media lackeys who they instruct. Because, I mean, one of the things I'd kind of like to ask Tony is, what sort of smoking guns are there in linking the police's actions, both in relation to arresting yourself and activist journalists and so on, but also their behaviour on January the 18th, where they were provoking the crowd with groups of Zionists who they protected and then grabbing people. I witnessed that. Steve witnessed it at close quarters. Had to save one or two people, and then ushering us. We were ushered into through a sort of a filter system into Trafalgar Square, only then to be, told that we shouldn't have been there and that we were, we had forced our way through, which was absolute patent nonsense. So where is the smoking gun? Linking the instructions from the Home Office, from Yvette Cooper, from Starmer, and coming back to Starmer and the Myopia Act, there is an absolute, he is, this book that's been published about, the way Starmer came to power and what he has done is quite interesting. It highlights the absolute ethical void that this guy has, the void of any, any sort of human responses to things. And he is using this and forcing this through people like Lammy, through sort of all the pressure on Labour Party members. Just don't mention it. It's not there. If we don't mention it, it's not there. And they seem to think that this is sustainable. How long can they sustain it?
Yeah, so Tony, your observations, firstly on the smoking gun, and secondly the comments in the chat about why Europe is so subservient to the US, and the further comment that, well, perhaps when trade sanctions come in, that won't be the case anymore. Do you want to respond on those 2 points?
In terms of the police action and the demonstrations, I mean, it's quite clear. There was heavy pressure from the very start from the Zionists saying that these demonstrations constitute a threat to Jewish people. And we saw Gideon Falls with the campaign against anti-Semitism deliberately walking into the crowd and against the direction of the march in order to prove that Jews were frightened, though he himself didn't seem particularly frightened. We saw that from the very start with Suella Braverman talking about marches of hate, though anyone who's been on the marches knows that they're anything but hateful. And anyone who's been on the marches, certainly if you're Jewish, knows that there's been no hostility to people who are Jewish. This is simply, again, another ruling class narrative. They want to believe it. They want to portray what's happening as being Jews versus Muslims, Jews versus Arabs. But it's got nothing to do with that at all, because there are many thousands of Jews who don't agree with genocide, who do draw the conclusion from the Holocaust that one genocide doesn't justify another genocide. But for the ruling class, of course, and for Israel in particular, the Holocaust entitles them to do just about anything they wish to the Palestinians. And in Israel today, there is an exterminationist mentality. I mean, people openly say, if only we could get rid of the Palestinians, press a button and make them all disappear. So, I mean, they say it without any irony, and then attend a Holocaust Memorial Day commemoration without twigging that this is really cognitive dissonance. But Israel is a settler colonial state, and that's what happens under settler colonialism. You either exclude the indigenous population or you exterminate them, or both. So that's why, as regards Europe, well, I mean, historically, in the wake of the Second World War, of course, you had very soon after the armistice and the victory over the Nazis, you had the Cold War, where US imperialism went again, of course, saw the Soviet Union as its enemy and formed NATO as an imperialist alliance under the pretense that the Soviet Union, which I always saw as defensive, was a nuclear threat, and so on and so forth. I mean, this served their purposes. So Europe was bound very tightly into the United States embrace, not least economically, with the Marshall Aid Plan and so on. I mean, Britain itself, for example, after the Second World War, was absolutely bankrupt. It had to go begging, cap in hand, to the United States for a $3 billion loan immediately after. And that was only granted on condition that the British currency, sterling, became convertible, because it operated in what was called the sterling area, which related to the colonies that we had. I mean, I don't want to go into the international relations now, but that was a situation. Europe was bankrupt, in essence, and relied on the United States to invest and to provide it with the money in order that they could then buy US goods, in essence. And that's carried on very much till today, with the dollar being a reserve currency. So the US can fund its deficit through borrowing, often enforced borrowing from abroad. But I suspect that Trump is beginning to unravel some of this. We see, for example, his declaration that he wants Greenland off Denmark, as if America has a right to anything that it chooses. And he adds an aside that Canada should become the 51st American state, regardless of the wishes of Canadians.
Well, yes,
I mean, this is madness in a sense, but it's indicative of the attitude of US imperialism today.
Yes, and Gaza will become the 54th American state.
Well, no, it won't become a state. It'll become like Puerto Rico, which is a colony. It certainly won't be a state.
Yeah, sure.
If they grant the stature of a state to Greenland or to Canada, they're quite privileged, because usually America doesn't grant that status. I mean, it did to Hawaii, but that's the exception. I mean, America colonizes somewhere and doesn't grant any democratic rights. But in Europe, I mean, it is interesting over Greenland, because France offered to send military forces to Greenland to defend it. So we have the prospect of a war between two NATO countries, because Denmark, of course, is also in NATO. So we are seeing, if you like, I think, the beginnings of an unraveling of Europe. I mean, we know that Orban and others in Europe are looking to Russia. That doesn't necessarily make it particularly brilliant. I don't think people should have illusions in Russia. But certainly America under Trump, with his tariff war and so on, is laying the basis, I think, for further conflict in the years ahead. Whether Europe breaks away from the United States, I think, is doubtful. I think there will remain strong ties. And one thing is for certain, I mean, the British poodle, as represented so admirably by Keir Starmer, will stay within the American orbit if it can, which is one reason, of course, why Starmer has lost interest in reversing Brexit, which you remember under Corbyn, he was all in favour of a second referendum. That's gone by the board. So I think we are living in different times, but very dangerous times as well. Even if Trump's idea of making Gaza into the Riviera of the Mediterranean, because even his right Republican friends have said that this is a non-starter. But I mean, Trump flies this, but what it really means is that Israel has the green light for further ethnic cleansing if it wants. I mean, my own view is, I mean, the ceasefire obviously is extremely precarious, but whether Israel wants to engage in a further bout of fighting with the Palestinian resistance and Hamas is an open question, given they have suffered serious casualties.
Yeah. Well, clearly they've lost the so-called war with Hamas. It's clear, and we've talked in previous meetings about the dying throes of both imperialism and the fact that Israel is a failed state. I mean, so these are desperate times.
One shouldn't overestimate it, but also the effect of what Trump has said has actually given a backbone for the first time ever to some of the Arab regimes. Jordan does not want Palestinian refugees because it knows if it has 1 million Palestinian refugees, King Hussein won't be on the throne for very long. And not only that, but of course the border will then shift dramatically to the Jordan River. And if you remember, the revisionist Zionists always had the slogan, the East Bank is ours and the West Bank is too. So, I mean, there would soon be a security threat necessitating a further Israeli right to defense over the Jordan River. So it would the process would go on. We know they're in Syria. We know they don't want to leave Lebanon. So, I mean, Israel is in a messianic expansionist phase at the moment. It might all end in tears as well, because you can overextend yourself. And
nonetheless, it's close to a failed state, and it's right at the bottom. I think probably BDS is working too, because Israel is right at the bottom of the list of favoured states with regard to trading. So all of those negative impacts will be felt very strongly. I'm going to pass over now to Linda, Laurie, and then Leslie. Levain, so over to you first, Linda.
I'm so sorry. It's just Mike Higgins. Linda died actually in 2023. It's just my out-of-date Zoom account.
I'm so sorry. Shall we change? Shall we change the
by
name?
all means, by all means do.
What's the name?
Although I'm very proud to carry her name, but my name is actually Mike Higgins. Very interesting conversations, and Tony, never short of things to say, and always very interesting what you have to say as well. And thank you for your lead off this evening. It's been really, really interesting. What I'm interested in is the views of yourself and others about the immediate perspectives for the world, because we are, as you've just said, in very unsafe times, I think. We have, I won't go through them because all the comrades here know as well, or if not better than me, what the various unstable regimes and parts of the world are. But, given what could develop in America, in the UK, in France, in Germany, and in other key pivotal states, we are really facing, I think, a major, potentially international crisis of unprecedented proportions. Unprecedented as in it's more than 1930 simply because of nuclear and other powers that may either unstabilize things further or at least result in pressure. And then we've got the unpredictability of people like Trump, who, whilst he doesn't quite do things as oddly as he claims and says he will, nonetheless, he's not a stable individual. But nonetheless, he reflects a strong trend within the US because, they've elected him twice, so it can't be an accident, I don't think. He obviously reflects a trend of dissatisfaction in the American working class and resentment in the middle class. So what I'm interested in knowing really from people at the meeting is, given we're talking here about the denial of the right to protest, that is one emblem, one symptom of democracy. The right to protest, the freedom to protest is not separate from, cannot be segregated from other democratic rights. The right to vote is important, but it's emblematic of all the other rights, like the right to protest. And we've already seen the police moving against us in the UK by picking on individuals like Tony and others, but also internationally, trying to close us down with the tacit support of New Labour or whatever they call themselves now. And I'm wondering where we feel as a group, because my knowledge of these things is far less than many others in this meeting. Where do we feel this is going? In the next 1, 2, 3 years, do we feel that the Labour movement will resist successfully and will push back on these moves against us? Or do we feel that the capitalist state will further be able to impose its will against us, and that racism will extend, and that we'll see not solely attacks on Palestinians, which of course are very important, but what they also represent in terms of attacks on black people and other minority ethnic communities, and for that matter, disabled people. And just very quickly, one example of that is the DWP saying it's now going to take over disabled people's bank accounts. You know, I mean, it's quite a threatening thing for them to say, but also we are quite a weak group, in inverted commas, to attack. But nonetheless, I do think there's an increased confidence on the part of the bourgeois, on the part of the ruling class, who at the moment don't seem to be sufficiently divided, taking into account, I know the points we've made about Farage versus the Tories and all the rest of it. How can we exploit that division in the ruling class? How can we stand a chance of winning in the next few years to overturn the moves against working class power and the attacks on us? Okay, I've finished.
Thank you. Sure. Thank you, Mike. I'll let Tony consider that while we hear from Leah. And clearly, it would appear that Starmer's clearly the next arm of the state, and there is no hope from Labour. But let's hear what Leah has to say. Over to you, Leah. It's good to see you.
Thanks so much. I've just a number of disparate points, really. So I don't want to respond. I'm very tempted to respond to Mike Higgins's excellent points. A slightly flippant point about Trump is he says that the US will buy Gaza and do it. I'm wondering who he's going to pay. But that is perhaps not the most important. But I mean, he clearly has no idea. And there seems to be a phenomenal lack of understanding on his part, but on many others as well, on the fact that the US is much weaker than it was globally, economically. He's worried about China, but it's not only China that's doing probably better than the US is, certainly in terms of manufacturing. I'm sorry to say that the misuse of anti-Semitism is still an issue that we on the left have to address. I think those of us in the Jewish bloc have taken it. I think it's very much our role, because all the crisis that many of us lived through in the Labour Party is didn't just happen in the United Kingdom, it happened throughout the world. And the adoption of the IHRA Act is part of what's enabled this to go on for so long. The screaming anti-Semitism at anything, and it being heard seriously at anything that where you criticize what Israel is doing. So we can't forget that issue, and that's not about centering Jews. It's about actually pointing out the absurdity, and again, this relates on the points that Mike was saying of exceptionalizing anti-Semitism as if somehow it's both the worst form of racism and the most dominant form. All racism is heinous, so we don't have to single out one as being particularly bad, and it's certainly not the most dominant form of racism at the moment. So that's another point. On the court stuff, what occurs to me, I don't know if people read in Squawk Box today that I come from Hastings. That's not so. We had the nurse who was he's also been hanging on for more than a year, or about a year, waiting for his court to, second hearing, usual stuff. And now they've dropped the charges. And he basically moved Sabra hummus, probably moved out of the fridge, and it went off. And so this is terrible, heinous profit loss for Sainsbury's. I mean, a few tubs of hummus in Hastings, Sainsbury's, and not quite dawn, but an 8 a.m. raid with his little daughter. You can read it, but they've dropped the case. They are a bit fed up with losing cases. The worrying thing is that some people are getting incarcerated for the year that they're waiting for sentences, but they are losing even in the courts. We don't have a completely tame thing. Another point. So this is fairly disparate, but looking at the Israeli hostages who came out, they did look pretty ill, and it's possible to be horrified by that. And even if hostages were fabulously well treated, being a hostage is in and of itself a terrible thing. Now, I'm sure you have debated before, if are you a hostage if you're a soldier or of military age that could get called into the reservists? But even so, there's no reason for you to be treated very badly. But the points that others have made perfectly eloquent, I don't need to go into, is what about the why is Trump horrified about how emaciated those Israelis and how they look like they'd just come out of Auschwitz, and yet similar images of Palestinians who were tortured and who were beaten literally on the way from their cells to the bus to be released, and that I think that the ones this weekend were all held under administrative detention. None of that gets coverage, so we need to think about what we can do about that, because it is pretty heinous. And I think, I've got various other little points, but I think that's enough disparate points from me. But it's lovely to be here, and we have the usual struggle. How do we get heard by outside of our bubble? But the actions that we're taking, the demonstrations, the horrors that people are seeing, even on in the limited ways that the mainstream media has to they can't not show the devastation, and people are generally on our side, certainly in terms of ceasefire, and the whole world, apart from Israel and tame senators in the United States, are absolutely horrified at the idea of the US taking over. So we shouldn't get too depressed, but it is tough, as we all know, and we can't give up now. We have to keep going, re-strengthen ourselves. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Leah. We will go back to Tony. I haven't heard again from Richard Medhurst. It's possible that he's not going to make it. On the IHRA definition, the Socialist Labour Network with Scottish PSC and also Jewish Network for Palestine had a meeting about the definition, and also about Holocaust Memorial Day. And I've heard today that it's quite possible that the GMC will be looking to adopt the IHRA definition. So any of you in the medical profession, please look out for that. And also any of you that want to join the Socialist Health Association, we will be seeking to challenge this and work on a campaign to challenge this. Please join the SHA as well, if you go along with its objectives about the NHS. So I'm going to go back to Tony. Obviously, Leah, you have many points addressed, practically all of the things we've discussed so far in the meeting, and more. And Tony, do you want to respond to the most recent comments?
I do have a message from Richard Medhurst, which says, please forgive me, Tony, and extend my apologies to all. This happened, his inability to get in as a result of the raid, that I have no working equipment left. I'll stay and listen till the end in any case. So that is a direct result, as he said, of the raid by the Austrian police, almost certainly in collaboration with the British police, who seized all this equipment. And that's a common feature of all of the raids. When I was raided back in December 2023, literally, again, every electronic device was seized by the police. And that causes immense disruption. Your phones, your computers, your backup drives, and so on. I mean, so you have to go through a process. You stop your SIM, then you buy another phone, and then you get back your number, and then you get back onto your account slowly. But you have to cross all sorts of hurdles to do that, and of course, it's an expensive business as well. So it isn't easy. And Richard is a journalist, so he has more equipment. He had 19 pages, a document of the stuff that they'd seized from him. So you can imagine they've taken virtually everything but the kitchen sink, so to speak. So that's why Richard can't make it, unfortunately. It is very unfortunate. What can I say about anti-Semitism? I mean, I was reading a book by one of the leading activists, Steven Sonnenband, of the 43 group, which is a group of a Jewish group, but included non-Jews, set up after the war when Oswald Mosley's union movement, as it was called then, was resurfacing. And he's describing what he called the institutional anti-Semitism of the Metropolitan Police, who sympathized with the fascists. And that's always been the case in the 70s with the battles against the National Front. The police made their own sympathies very clear. And today you see the same racism. I mean, institutional racism has been part of the Metropolitan Police. It's apple pie to them in a sense. It goes with the territory. So when they and the ruling class say they're opposed to anti-Semitism, it tells me two things. Firstly, they're lying, of course. But secondly, if anti-Semitism was a problem, then they wouldn't. They obviously wouldn't be so concerned. It's precisely because of the lack of anti-Semitism in this society, the complete lack of any state racism. But even on a personal basis, there's very, very little anti-Semitism. I can't think the last time I met it, and that's why they've redefined anti-Semitism as hostility to Zionism and what they call the Jewish state. In other words, imperialism, because Israel is, if you like, the kind of, and Jews themselves provide the moral pretext, the idea that Israel was some form of recompense for Jews as a result of what was done to them in the Holocaust. Of course, it wasn't. I mean, if you look at Israel and how it behaved, then it drew very much the same lessons of Jewish racial purity, for example, lessons of ethnic cleansing, lessons of racism and apartheid structure within Israel, which replicated certainly between 1933 and 39 in terms of the Palestinian population, which could only live in certain places, was under military rule, and so on and so forth. Today, I mean, that is even clearer. I mean, when you have Gallant, a defense minister, at the very beginning of the attack on Gaza, called Palestinians human animals, he was using exactly the same description that Himmler used in a very famous speech in Posen on the 4th of October 1943, when he was addressing senior SS generals and explaining why the Holocaust was necessary. He described Jews as human animals in a context of saying we treat animals kindly and we treat the human animals kindly too. Well, his idea of what was kind is probably not most of our view, but that was Himmler, and Yoav Gallant came out with this, and it's been repeated ever since, that the Palestinians are human animals. So you dehumanize people in exactly the same way as the Nazis did. It's interesting. I was reading Raoul Hilberg, who's the foremost Holocaust historian today, and I just picked up on a passage. You see, the Nazis, sorry, this is a bit of a side tangent, but I think it might be interesting to people.
Okay, comrade.
That when the extermination of Jews started, it began with the Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. And it was Einsatzgruppen killing squads who shot Jews and forced them to dig ditches, and they then fell into them and so on. And this started to have quite a catastrophic effect on the SS, I mean, or members of it. And they opened up, in fact, a mental asylum in the East to deal with it. And it was pointed out that they were creating human wrecks to Himmler. And that was one of the major reasons why they turned to the gas chambers. The gas chambers weren't originally in their plans. They'd been used on the disabled within Germany. And in fact, what happened was the gas trucks literally trundled from Germany to Poland to set up the first extermination camp. But they experimented with different killing methods. And Hilberg describes how one of the experiments was whether, in fact, you could kill large numbers of people through high explosives. Well, it was a disaster. They found out you couldn't. But I suspect if they had the £2,000 bombs that Israel now has, the bunker busters, they might have changed their mind, because they might have found it was more efficient to bomb a ghetto rather than to take them all the way to Auschwitz or Belzec or wherever and exterminate them. So that mentality has persisted, and Israel, without a doubt, has been engaged in extermination, without a doubt. When you bomb tent encampments of people on the pretext that there's a Hamas leader there, and we're having all sorts of revelations about how they've used these bunker buster bombs, we can be in no doubt about what is genocide and the fact that it's been committed. And that's Nazi-like behavior, I'm afraid, although that's anti-Semitic under the IHRA. Because, of course, the IHRA isn't about anti-Semitism at all. It's about protecting Israel and about justifying imperialism support for it. All the other comments I agree with. What do people expect if you starve a population and stop aid getting in? Then, of course, it's going to affect your prisoners. But without a doubt, I mean, prisoners who've come out said their main fear was being killed by an Israeli bomb. So it was obviously clear that Israel didn't bother.
Yes.
That's what Mass Hannibal is about.
Yes.
You kill your hostages.
Indeed. Yes. So you don't have to release lots of Palestinian hostages. So there's a comment from Maria about Rafi Berg, who controls the BBC's Israel Palestine output. Have a look at that comment, and there's a link to a news item there as well about it. Steve, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, Esther. I wanted to take up a couple of points. First of all, going back to what Mike Higgins said, which I think was a very important contribution. The UK is, I would argue, is an unstable regime. And it has been stable for a long, long time. We've become an unstable regime in which there's a crisis of democracy and a decay and putrefaction and degeneration. Therefore, we're in a very dangerous situation. And it's not just about our foreign policy, it's also very much about what's happening domestically. There is a general crisis of our democracy. And so in that context, what Tony's telling us about and what Richard would be telling about, and many other examples, are cases, or if you like, case studies in the crisis of our democracy. And there is a danger. We are actually seeing a rise of racism in this country, even amongst young people, and the danger of fascism. And we need a democratic movement. We need to take seriously the crisis of democracy. To a general crisis, there has to be a general answer. And I think Mike was drawing attention to that. Now, it's not a silly argument between myself and Tony about whether we use the words the state or the crown. I mean, if you don't like the word crown, you could use the word United Kingdom. But you see, the state is an abstraction. It's kind of like calling everything fruit as opposed to apples, pears, and blackberries or whatever, which actually do exist. Tony in court will be facing the power of the crown, and he'll see it. It'll be actually symbolically looking at him as he's sitting there in court. Because we don't actually have a state in the way our history was. Well, we have the crown, which was created by an actual historical process of class struggle. And if you just call it the state, it's almost as if you've removed all of the class struggle that shaped us and got us to where we are today. So it's not just a silly argument about what words we use. It is also about what do we do? How do we confront the power that we have to deal with if we're going to get an answer to the crisis of democracy? What are we going to do about the crown? Or if Tony said, what are we going to do about the state then? Either way, but it's the crown. That's what we have to deal with. Now,
okay.
Just one other point. I think Mike made a point, and I will stop there. Mike made a very important point. Have we just seen a shift in the way the crown is relating to this on January the 18th, or what was happening to Tony before that? That there is actually a move going on to repress it, which we didn't see before, which is taking shape now. January the 18th was a very important event, but of course Tony was also arrested before then. So perhaps what was happening to Tony was the first event that comes to fruition on January the 18th. I think they're all connected to a shift that's taking place, not just a continuation, but a shift.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Steve. And I'm sure that discussion about the state versus the crown versus the Home Office or whoever we think is pulling the strings will continue. So I'm going to go back to Tony now. We don't have any more hands raised. Tony, I think you've probably summed up, but do you have anything further you'd like to say?
Well, I'll respond to Steve.
Yeah.
Because it's part, as he says, of a continuing debate.
Yes.
He's absolutely right. I will be facing a symbol of the crown on the wall of the court above the judge. And my charge sheet says His Majesty, I think it is, versus Tony Greenstein. I mean, I was thinking of writing to King Charles to ask how he could do this, but I thought maybe I shouldn't, or I might not get a reply. But
think about
that. The state, it is the state, but the state takes the form of the crown in Britain. In the United States, it will take the form of the US government. But the forces are very much the same. It's not actually King Charles. He doesn't any longer have the powers that his ancestors would have had. And therefore, the British state cloaks itself in the powers of the crown and acts accordingly. And if the crown was to get out, or the individual monarch was to get out of line, then there would be an abdication crisis, undoubtedly. So I think it's a distinction without a difference, to be quite honest. Whether it's a Republican government as in France and America, or a monarchy like in Britain and Sweden, the powers used are the same. What we are seeing throughout Europe, whether it's Germany, France, Britain, Austria, Switzerland, and so on, are increasingly coercive measures and attacks on the right of Palestinians and their supporters, the Solidarity Movement. Let us not forget Ali Abu Nima, who was the editor of Electronic Intifada, was arrested 2 weeks ago and held 3 days incommunicado in Switzerland, which most people think of as an ideal alpine resort rather than a particularly nasty state. But this is happening all over Europe. There is an attack on democratic rights, and in particular a Palestine Solidarity Movement. Germany is particularly iniquitous. It seems to be operating on the basis that having committed one Holocaust, it's justified in supporting another. I mean, Germany historically has had a pretty atrocious record. I mean, when I pointed out in a blog that the first genocide it was involved in was the Herero and the Nama people in Southwest Africa between 1906 and 1908. Someone wrote into me saying, no, you're wrong. It was actually the Maji Maji rising in East Africa, Tanganyika, or now Tanzania, where they killed, I think, 300,000 people, which preceded that. So Germany has a particularly atrocious record. And in fact, as I pointed out, the racial scientists who were involved in the extermination and medical experimentation at Shark Island in Namibia went on to train the SS. A guy called Eugen Fischer, in particular, was a doctor who headed the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute of Anthropology. So all of these things come together. We are living in very, very dangerous times. And what I would say is, it's time that the left got its act together and started unifying to roll back the attacks of the state, because nothing is inevitable. We don't have to let Nigel Farage and the Reform occupy the position they do. For example, I mean, Farage stands for an insurance-based system of national health. You see the reaction to the assassination of the head of United Healthcare in America. The company thought they'd get sympathy. But in fact, thousands of people made clear that they were delighted at the death of this man who'd caused the death of their own relatives, because the profit margin to United Health demanded that they don't even adhere to the contracts that are taken out by people for insurance. And that shows that if have an insurance-based system, then the power lies with the insurance company, not with the doctors. So, I mean, this is one example where the left does really need to get its act together.
Absolutely.
The wholesale
Yes.
privatization of, if
Everything.
I went and poured cyanide down the drains, I'd probably be arrested. But if Southern Water does it, then it simply gets a share bonus instead. So, that's the kind of society we're living in. So we do have to get our act together. And Palestine is at the heart of that, just like the struggle against apartheid was in South Africa 30, 40 years ago. And we should make no apologies. Israel is not a Jewish state, except in the racial supremacist sense. There is nothing Jewish about it in terms historically of Jewish values. It has produced very little in terms of Jewish culture, not surprisingly, because it's infested with the racial supremacist ideas that have prevailed as a result. And if you think of all the great Jewish people historically, Einstein, Freud, Spinoza, and so on, they're all from the diaspora. They're not from Israel. Israel has produced very little, and what it has produced, it's often been the few anti-Zionists within it. So I think we should be clear. The IHRA is not about anti-Semitism. It's about protecting imperialism and racism and the Israeli state's ethnic cleansing. Okay, well, I think I've said probably as much as I can, but there is just one more thing. There is a massive need for a campaign against the use of anti-terrorism laws against people in the Palestine solidarity movement. I'm not alone. There are probably 20 to 30 people at least. It's very difficult keeping track of it, but there is a need, and we see the kind of more bourgeois civil liberties organizations like Liberty, for example, running a mile from taking a position because they know how politically contentious it is. So I think we have to watch this space. Okay, thank you very much for an interesting discussion.
Well, thank you very much, all of you, for coming to this evening's meeting. We're obviously sorry that Richard wasn't able to make it, but there is a link in the chat to a recording that Richard's provided. Thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Steve, did you want to make a final comment?
Briefly,
to your members? Yeah.
Just echo. I'll just echo last thing that Tony said. I think that's all really, is that the left does need to get its act together. The left does need to unite. I'll make the point, however, unless we take the question of democracy really seriously, and really think it out, because the left generally isn't that interested, hasn't been that interested in democratic questions. And it's not just single issues that we mention. We have to do single issue campaigns. We need a general case for a democratic country. However we phrase that, that's what has to be worked out. And if we do that, then we can mobilize a large number of people, because the majority of people in this country want to live in a more democratic country than the one we're actually living in.
Yes, and they want hope. Okay.
And we want hope.
Thank you, everybody, and look forward to seeing you at another meeting or program.
Yeah, thank you very much for the evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.